hoping for my slides to appear. It seems to be a common problem. Oh, here we go. In our field, what counts is both the quality and the impact of the work that we do. And okay, I got it. It's this one here. Okay. So it's both the quality and the impact. And if the quality does not result in an impact, it gets lost in translation. This is what I've learned during a few decades of efforts, and I'll show you a little bit of what I think I have learned. And I hope to provoke you, and I hope to inspire you to continue what you're doing with a greater impact. So, first of all, here we have an environmental setting. It happens to be the Faroe Islands. It's a community north of Scotland, between Norway and Iceland, way up in the North Atlantic. And those people are exposed to methylmercury from their marine diet. And what we're trying in environmental epidemiology is to learn from the exposed communities. And what we also need to do is to give them back some information and hopefully also an improved environment and perhaps even a better world for all of us to live in. So this is what I learned about environmental epidemiology. The first major paper we published about methylmercury, and I hope this is going to make you feel good about it, was rejected by 3 journals. They simply refused to consider a paper like this that claimed that something as innocuous that we all exposed to, like methylmercury, could have a disadvantageous effect on children's brain development. So finally, the specialty journal felt pity and considered this. And we went through 6 major revisions before the reviewers finally said, oh, let them, finally get published. So we did get published. And what happened was that this paper has now been cited close to 1,000 times. It's the most cited paper ever in the history of this journal. So I think the editor at the time was actually very pleased that he eventually made that decision. Now, our work was later reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences, the National Research Council, and they actually decided that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency should rely on our work when deciding on an exposure limit for methylmercury. But there were reactions to this. So suddenly in the metro in Washington, you could see posters like this. This was a whole-page advertisement in the New Yorker, various magazines like this, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and clearly the message was, don't worry about mercury in fish. It's only if you eat, Moby Dick type canned whale meat or something, that's when you should worry. Now, I'll get back to that message in a moment. Even Wall Street Journal picked this up, and they wrote an editorial where they mentioned the super greens, that they based their misinformation on a problematic study of Faroe Islands children. The Faroe mothers consumed enormous amounts of mercury, though from seafood such as whale, most Americans don't eat. Now, that was the reaction to our work. So it took a few years, but finally this reached the attention of the United Nations Environment Program. And in 2013, the UN member states decided on the first convention that was focusing on what's called a sunset chemical, a specific pollutant, and approved the Minamata Convention. Now, and the United States was the first country to ratify it. So we have moved very far. This happened in 2013. We've moved very far since the 1997 publication of this miserable paper that several journals wanted to reject. So I need to ask the question, I had this impact, I would claim. Are we having enough of an impact in environmental epidemiology? Well, if you look at the abstracts from this meeting, and I went to the sources who really know about the numbers, namely Michael Krzyzanowski and Francesco Forestier, you can see that only about 20% of the abstracts at this meeting indicated that their work had policy implications. I'm not sure if this is a low number or a high number. I think much of the work is on its way to having a policy or potential policy impact, but I think it's very important we keep that as a goal in front of us. So, and before we get there, this is certainly, we're looking at a minefield here from the evidence building and the validity considerations through the translation of what we want to tell the decision makers, and finally the competition for decisions on how to improve the environment and create a better world. So once we're beyond the evidence building and the weight of the evidence, we enter controversy. So here's this truck on the highway. You're sitting in this little car, and on the back of the truck it says, well, the scientific community is divided. Some say this stuff is dangerous, some say it isn't. You know, this is a common situation, and our concern is, of course, first of all, could this material in that truck be like dioxin or asbestos? If we think it's not all that dangerous, how dangerous could it be? What would the worst case scenario be? So that's one issue. And when we look at the evidence, we really have to study carefully whether the findings really represent that specific hazard and the potential outcomes. Now, I want to say a few words about John Goldsmith. I would wonder, how would John have reacted at this time? And I have to tell you a short anecdote about how I met him. I was a young physician in the 1970s, and John was, I think he was going to Stockholm, and he stopped over in Copenhagen. And he said to me, we had a very brief conversation, he said to me, you know, you should be aware that air pollution is a lot more dangerous than most people think. And at the time there was lead in the air pollution, 1,000 tons of lead was emitted to the atmosphere every day globally. And so he essentially got me started in looking into lead poisoning, and that was an important step in my career, and that I'm grateful to John Goldsmith for having initiated me, for having inspired me. But I found this quotation here from one of the important papers that he wrote, and he essentially said we should doubt the existence of thresholds, and we should also challenge the traditional methods of risk assessment. So, as a consequence of our studies, we sort of looked at a model. We developed a model, Phil Landrigan and I, and it looked to us like what has been happening here is that we have underestimated the extent of the hazards around us. Because in the beginning, we didn't think that this toxicity extended much beyond occupational health. And then there were the poisoning incidents, and people started looking at children as potentially vulnerable populations. And what we see today is what we call a silent pandemic, because most of the kids affected don't have a diagnosis, but they are just a little bit slower. They have various deficits. They may not be able to complete school. There's no diagnosis. But for them and for the families affected, this is a serious impact. And we have ignored it for much too long. Now, lead in particular showed how it moved on this curve, and methyl mercury followed. And we're now seeing PCBs, of course, and manganese, fluoride, organophosphate, pesticides, other pesticides, solvents, and there's a whole lot of other toxicants. I predict, from what we've seen with many of these substances, that we will find that they are much more serious public health hazards than we've been thinking in the past. Let me show you this in a different way in terms of an iceberg, because what we see is only the tip of this iceberg, those 12 or 13 compounds where we have sufficient epidemiological evidence they are hazardous to brain development in humans. But there's a lot of chemicals that we know can enter the brain and cause adverse effects in adults. And then there is this number that is somehow, it's above 1,000, where we have animal evidence. But there's no systematic testing. Not even REACH demands any testing of chemical substances in regard to effects on brain development. And I think that's a crime, that we release chemicals in the environment to food, to drinking water, to the air that can harm, I would say, the most precious organ, namely the brain. So why is this recognition happening so slowly? Well, the fact is that we have been naive. We have been thinking that there were some types of dictum that we believed in, namely that the placenta protects the fetus. I learned that in medical school, and this was wrong. And it was seriously wrong and dangerous. We also thought that children, if you just, you know from pharmacology, if you adjust for the body weight, they're just like little adults. No, they're much more vulnerable. We thought that adverse effects, like for many childhood diseases, are reversible. They may not be. And we thought that subtle toxicity, like on the brain, that we could ignore it. We thought that untested chemicals can be regarded as safe. Not true. And finally, we are expecting that science can settle all the uncertainties, and we won't make a decision until we're sure that we know what we're doing. So I think all of these assumptions are dangerous, and we need to confront them and insist that if we are not acting differently, we are committing a crime against public health. So here's what we have learned from neuroscience and embryology and environmental epidemiology, namely that vulnerability is the price we're paying for our complex brain. We have the most advanced brain in the animal kingdom, although we know of people who don't behave as if they have such a complex brain. But physiologically, there is an enormous number of brain cells packed in between your ears that is incredibly complex. And the interconnections between those brain cells, it is unbelievable that we can generate such an organ. And clearly, because it's so complex, the development is highly vulnerable to chemical toxins. The second thing that we have learned is that it's particularly during early development that the nervous system is vulnerable. And finally, that the changes that happen during early development, they are likely to be permanent. You can't go back and do this over. There's no way. You only have one chance to develop a brain. So you might say, but is this really controversial? Well, apparently it is. Here's a reaction that we got from, I gotta get my props ready here. Hang on a second. Do I really look like an environmental radical? Well, these people think that I'm a toxic terrorist. And if you look at where the source of this statement, you might say, take it as a compliment. I think that the question we have to ask is what I'm saying, is that all fantasy and illusion? And am I just promoting myself as a matter of attracting attention to myself and some environmental, some revolutionary, radical environmental agenda? Is this what's happening? I believe that we have sufficient evidence to behave a little bit as radicals and a little bit as toxic terrorists, if that's what they insist on calling it, because we have the evidence and we have to stand up for it. And this is what I've known, what I've learned during these years, because we have. What we have to challenge is statements like in this report that came out from the International Life Science Institute with the support from US federal agencies. What they said is that, well, maybe sometimes children are more vulnerable than adults, but we have to get the evidence on a case-by-case basis, which is the same as saying, let's see what happens until we know for sure for lead, methylmercury, manganese, fluoride, organophosphate, pesticides, etc. And I would say such a demand for more research is again criminal. But the problem is that we are faced with that kind of opposition, and it's also tempting to have people say, we want you to do more of this thing. And so this is exactly what's happening, that we are studying the same thing over and over. Like the French say, we're polishing the same stone more and more. I've looked at it doing bibliometric statistics, and there is more than 1,000 publications every year on lead. In public health and toxicology journals, more than 1,000 publications. There's several hundred on mercury. And I think David Savitz wrote in Epidemiology very recently where he argued that more research may not be needed. Well said, David. This is exactly what I think that our statistics show, and I would like to remind you of the scriptures of the what you would call the Matthew principle, for unto everyone that hath shall be given. And it's like, because there's so much evidence on lead and mercury, let's study it some more. We got to put a stop to that phenomenon because there's so many unstudied pollutants that we need to look at more carefully. And many of the studies show the problem that the red study on the left illustrates, where we would like to have a study like the green one. And my point is that perhaps the red study is one that we should more likely react to, because the upper confidence limit shows that the problem could actually be much bigger than we would like it to be. So there are some challenges that we're faced with, and these are well-known challenges that I don't want to explain in detail. But one response to this could be that we become apathic and resignation, because, hey, this is so difficult, this is fraught with problems, but we have a purpose in our work, and we must be determined to generate prudent and useful inference. So to address these challenges, we need better translation. We need to avoid being lost like the movie in translation. And here's a caricature that shows you exactly what vested interests and reticent regulatory agencies, in the way that they would react. And some researchers are tempted to support them. Oh yes, let's do some more of this because we are really, really happy to replicate, and we are very happy to get some more funding. But the public health costs are enormous. We have looked at the costs associated with what I call chemical brain drain from endocrine disruptors. These are the calculations for the European Union associated with current exposures to endocrine disruptors. And the column on the right represents mainly pesticides that interfere with the endocrine system and also brain development. This number, 132 billion euros per year for the European Union, is an enormous cost. And you can see it's a whole lot more than the male reproductive disorders on the far left, premature death and other endocrine diseases. So the big problem is, of course, who should benefit from the doubt and from the uncertainties. And down here on the beach, there's a tug of war going on. And this is like a crossfire, which is a condition for being in environmental epidemiology, because we must maintain an impeccably neutral stance and at the same time respond vigorously to environmental injustice. So we differ in attitude, and here comes three caricatures, the specialists and something I call the prostitute, and then the activist. Now, the specialist here, and here's a quotation from a paper, and there I could have mentioned many other quotations where people say, we've really got to dig deeper here to understand the mechanism and the interactions of biochemistry and the possible confounding and so on. And that's exactly what certain vested interests would like to see, and then they say, well, let's study this somewhere. Now I get to the prostitute, and I have shown here a weathercock. Here it's a pig. But anyway, this is a colleague who has said this to the New York Times. He also said the same thing to Nature. And recently, the same people wrote a paper in the WHO Bulletin where they said, hey, ocean fish is safe. It's only if people eat whale meat. And you heard that before. So now we know the source. And the tuna industry is saying the same thing. But the oceans have been so polluted with mercury that all of the mercury concentrations in fish are about 10 times higher than they would have been without anthropogenic mercury pollution. And this is what they forget. But anyway, these weathercocks, or whatever you want to call them, are essentially polluting the debate, in my mind, in an unethical way. And then there is the activist, and I could have chosen something from ISEE's website, But this is from a publication in an international journal of gynecology and obstetrics. It's from the FIGO leadership, the International Federation for Gynecology and Obstetrics. And I think this quotation illustrates that there are clinicians who are on our side. And I think that a collaboration with FIGO might be very productive for our society, and I hope that something can be worked out in that regard. So the complexities demand that we are careful the way we draw conclusions, and so I want to mention a couple of issues that are particularly important. Developmental exposure, we're usually not assessing that as carefully as we should. The fact that thresholds can't be observed, we may not know for sure if we're looking at the critical organ. Are we looking at something that illustrates the most sensitive outcomes? It's hard to know. And oftentimes we focus on confounding because we are concerned that we are overestimating the adverse effects. But the real problem is oftentimes underestimation, often because of imprecision of the exposure estimate, because that's the independent exposure parameter which we assume to be precise. And there are very few publications in our field where they take that into regard, especially in regard to the underestimation of risks. Hypersusceptibility, it can be genetic and otherwise. We have ranges of susceptibility, and this is certainly an important issue. So confronting all of this, there are like two views here, and one is the science narrative, and I've referred to the specialist moments ago, where people like me are considered interfering because we are politicking in an unwarranted way, and the public health perspective says, oh, but all of those people who still consider confounding and think we're overestimating risks, they are just doing callous ivory towering, and we have to get away from that. Now, I have a concern because, quite frankly, I mean, I'm really moved to be here today, and I'm, seeing John's daughter and son, and having talked to them, and having heard these nice words from the committee. But I recently read a paper from California where they had looked not at scientists but at industrialists, and they found that every time some famous industrialist gets an award, then immediately after that, that industrialist will underperform. So you may recognize that as a regression toward the mean. And I think that's the explanation for that phenomenon. But I'm really concerned that, getting this prestigious award, that from now on I will underperform. So, which means that I need your help, and the purpose of my presentation here is to inspire you so that my underperformance will be greatly overpowered by all of your efforts. Now, there's another angle to this, and I have to admit that last year I received a toxicology award from a journal, and the editor of that journal wrote, a very nice piece, and then it has just been published, and then when that was entered into the record at the Web of Science, now look, this is what happened. So the Web of Science thought that, a piece with such a nice presentation of my work, it had to be an obituary. So I'd like, I'm quite willing, you know, as a condition of the real life conditions when I get this award, to live with the fact that I'm likely going to underperform for a while. But this kind of extreme underperformance, which I understand is irreversible, I don't think that I'm quite ready for that yet. So here's the situation, and here's for kids, it's a chemical brain drain, and for awardees, it's the underperformance that I'm illustrating here. There is no room for underperformance in our field. We have a huge task in front of us. We need all of the intelligence of this auditorium and the society. And I would also say that the future of environmental epidemiology depends on the next generation being at least as smart as, I mean, there are some of the world's smartest people in this room, I know, but we need more environmental epidemiologists than they have to be at least as smart as we are. Otherwise, we are in a really, really bad situation. Now, I'm coming back to John Goldsmith, and I think that if John had been here, he would say that it is in the responsible translation of the evidence that our field shows its commitment to public health. And so we have a lot of work to do, and fortunately, John inspired us, and there are many leaders in this field who learned from John and who are carrying on the torch. So coming back to the Faroese village, we also owe this to the exposed populations. We must turn their suffering into a prescription for action. My mentor at Mount Sinai in New York City, Irving Selikoff, said, "Never forget that behind the numbers in your tables are human destinies, although the tears have been wiped away." And I think that was a very wise statement. We need to understand that environmental epidemiology is about people. It's about creating a better world for all of us. To me, Mercury was an eye-opener. I learned what epidemiology could do and what I had to stand up for. When I had my difficulties and was challenged by the tuna industry and other vested interests, and there were web pages criticizing me, putting statements together to illustrate that I'm a complete idiot and radical. I told Joel Schwartz about it at the time, and Joel looked me in the eye and he said, "But would you rather that they be your friends?" So, and Harvard's legal office actually found out that the people who were generating these campaigns to make Mercury safe, those were the same people who were also involved in convincing decision makers that it's really relevant and appropriate to sell sugary beverages in schools and advertise tobacco products near schools, sell alcoholic beverages to minors, and similar, liberal or what we call it, libertarian agendas. And so I would say I'm perhaps a whole lot better off. Even if there are occasional difficulties, I think I'm a whole lot better off being together with you here at ISEE, you radicals, you toxic terrorists or whatever, and I hope you all are, because this family of ours here, we are bound to be successful, perhaps only little by little, but if we stand together and work on our joint agenda, we can only be successful, and this is what I hope. Thank you very much.
So I know that Philippe was interested in hearing comments and discussion on his talk. We have plenty of time. If anybody has anything they want to add, ask, comment on, it'd be great. Manolis, there's a mic back there.
I have a comment, but before doing my comment, Philippe, I just wanted to thank you. It's very stimulating, I think, for all of us, having people like you doing outstanding research and then making it matter and fighting for what you believe is right. So, and this is a lesson for all of us, so thank you. And I think as ISC, it's an honor for us having you as the Goldsmith awardee. So I just wanted to express this, and I wanted to correct a statistical, a percentage that you gave about the 20% papers in this conference referring to policy. Actually, there are many more, even though they don't refer to policy in the abstracts. It is just that for many people, you don't want to make policy statements from your own paper because we base policy mostly on cumulative evidence rather than on single studies, although there are sometimes that single studies make the difference as your study.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, George Thurston, NYU. You know, I just wanted to, also I was going to thank you for, you know, your strength in speaking truth to power, because I think that is what is needed, especially with environmental pollution effects, which are so subtle and to, you know, really need to be studied carefully. And I do agree with you that scientists are way too often really afraid to step out and make a policy statement on things, and shouldn't be, because you know, your experience, you look very healthy and well despite all of the attacks, you know, and you're unaffected. And I myself have been vilified in the business, and I've been subpoenaed by Congress, and, you know, really very little effect on you. And others here, Doug Dockery and Joel Schwartz, well, maybe Joel was justified, but Joel, but Joel, they've been attacked, and really, it's not that bad, folks. Stand up, say what you research. Don't let politicians interpret your research. You know it best. Tell them what it means. And say it to the, speak to power, as Philippe has done.
Philippe, this is Raymond Nitra up here in the balcony waving at you and congratulating you on this well-deserved award. I do want to point out something about John Goldsmith's quotation that you gave, that he was arguing by analogy. He was saying, on the basis of what we know about several agents, we should be suspicious about other ones. And that leads me to maybe disagree a little bit with your idea that we shouldn't study lead anymore. Because there's 100,000 agents out there. We can't study all of them. We're going to have to reason by analogy. And we keep learning new unpleasant things about lead and about mercury with other effects. It's not that we need this new information to ban lead paint, but we need it to make analogies of things that we never have the time or money to study.
Ms. Mustafa from Nigeria. I think for me, the wow moment for today is when you share the quotation where the American Council of Health says you're a toxic terrorist. Back home, I find a lot of people making jest of environmental scientists and epidemiologists. We get called names like you are Erin Brockovich, and people make sarcastic comments, but I never knew that in an advanced country, just 2 years ago, people could still make that. But my question is, at the stage of your career, when all these attacks were coming, did you have any kind of support network from your employer or any society?
Okay, let me respond very briefly to all of these very welcome comments. What I'm saying is not that the tasks in front of us are easy and can be handled within the next few years. What I'm saying is that we got to keep that essentially internal conflict that we have. We got to keep our eyes on it all the time, because we have to appear impeccably neutral and scientific. And because otherwise, when we talk to employers or to industrial interests, regulatory agencies, or whatever what these vested interests are, and NGOs, we got to represent the best of science. And what I've seen at this meeting and at other ISE meetings is that we do represent excellent science in our field. And I'm very proud of being part of ISE. I think we have the capability of moving on. But at the same time, we should not forget our determination to help stimulate decisions to make this a better world to live in for all of us. And we need to figure out how to do that while still representing the best of science. And it is tough. And I believe that the conversations we have here during the breaks and in other interactions, I think those discussions are inspiring. I have learned a lot myself from this society, and I hope that all of you will continue coming to the annual meetings and, of course, reading the journals and continue contributing, because we have a lot of challenges in front of you. We need all of your intelligence and capabilities and your commitment, but we can do it.
More comments. I think I see Ronnie.
Ronnie Levin. And I also wanted to thank you, Philippe, for leading the way, but also to mention to the rest of us that there's a lot of room for individual scientists and individual professionals to lead the way. And in the US, in Flint, Michigan, one single solitary pediatrician published an article. Well, first she just went to the powers that be and she said blood lead levels are going up. And they totally trashed her. And then some mouthy engineer from Virginia Tech came in and started doing water samples. And he said, this is awful. And so what I'd like to say is that we need to learn to personally be those kind of scientists, where you don't have to be tall and you don't have to be pretty, but you do have to commit yourself to saying what's there. And so thank you for leading the way.
Any other comments? We all ready for reception? Okay, well, thank you again. It was a wonderful talk.